you very much for having me and for the opportunity to speak with you. So my name's Emily Nicolson. I'm from Deakin University in Melbourne. So today I'm going to talk to you about what is needed for the post-2020 framework to be effective for ecosystems. And apologies for anyone who saw my presentation at ESA, because there's some chunks that are quite similar. I'd like to acknowledge my many co-authors and collaborators in this work, and I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where I work and live, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and the Indigenous people around the world who are playing vital roles in caring for country and sustaining ecosystems. So today I'm going to talk about why we need an ecosystem goal in the post-2020 framework, why it's possible and how it can be framed and met. A lot of my presentation comes from this recent paper that you can see on the slide. We've already had the introduction to the post-2020 framework. It's the successor to the Aichi targets of the strategic plan for biodiversity, which were largely not met. As you may know, the Aichi targets included a very clear target for species, target 12 on extinctions, but lacked a comparable target for ecosystems, which is what James mentioned. Instead, there were the references to specific ecosystem types like forests and coral reefs that were scattered across multiple targets, but we didn't have a clear aspiration for all ecosystems. So the post-2020 framework has addressed ecosystems in Goal A, which is an excellent start, as James mentioned, but I would argue that its current drafting is not adequate for sustaining ecosystems, but could be improved by some relatively straightforward ways. And of course, this isn't just important for the conventional biological diversity, but it really, the way that these goals and targets are framed and written and the indicators that we choose are really important for other policy frameworks, but also for national policies and legislation to design the actions that we need to reverse biodiversity loss worldwide. So a strong goal for ecosystems is really needed in the post-2020 framework because ecosystems are fundamental to meeting all of the objectives of the CBD, which Alison mentioned, and also the different goals of the outcomes of the post-2020 global biodiversity framework, which I'll show here in this figure. So the vast majority of species and genetic diversity depends on safeguarding the diversity of natural ecosystems, but also the goals for sustainable use and maintaining nature's contributions to people, shown here in orange, and also for meeting, for the fair and equitable sharing of the benefits of biodiversity in blue. Because ecosystems sustain ecosystem functions, processes and diversity. The last decades have seen some really big advances in the science to allow the design and implementation of an ecosystem goal, which we probably didn't have for the Aichi targets. So we now have widely accepted, practical and workable definitions of ecosystems and their collapse that have stood up legally and in practical implementation worldwide. Many of these definitions were formalised in the Global Standard for Ecosystem Risk Assessment, which is the IUCN Red List of Ecosystems. So these definitions, just really quickly, ecosystems are made up of the living or biotic components, the abiotic environment, the processes and interactions within and between them, and the physical space in which these operate. Ecosystem collapse is the endpoint of decline, degradation, and loss of ecosystems, where an ecosystem type loses its defining features, its species, its structure, and its functions, and is replaced by a different, often depauperate ecosystem type. Now, these definitions are entirely consistent with Australian policy because Australia has, in principle, adopted the IUCN Red List of Ecosystems category and criteria under the Common Assessment Method under the EPBC Act and other state environmental legislation. So in addition to these definitions, there's been these huge advances in ecosystem mapping, particularly through remote sensing. And this means that we can see, we can quantify trends in an increasing array of ecosystem types around the world, from the level of ecosystem type to biome, like tropical forests. And just I've got on this slide shown a few examples. We've got these extraordinary data on corals, intertidal ecosystems, mangroves, cloud forests, sea ice. Every day, the list of ecosystem types we can monitor and map seems to have grown. We also now have global agreed frameworks for classifying and grouping ecosystems, which we didn't really have in a very consistent way. And this is particularly through the IUCN Global Ecosystem Typology, which was developed through consultation, review and revision with over 100 specialists and experts worldwide, led by David Keith, who's based here in Sydney at the University of New South Wales and in the Department of, I think it's called DPI now in New South Wales. So the global ecosystem typology has been adopted and recognised by international bodies like the UN Statistical Division to support their ecosystem accounting. It was mentioned in the post-2020 framework, in the monitoring framework, and also the FAO. And I encourage you to have a look at the website where you can explore the ecosystems of the world through descriptions, maps and photos. And it gives a great sense of the diversity of our planet. And through these global standards like the IUCN Red List of Ecosystems and the UN System for Environmental Economic Accounting, we now have global standards for measuring ecosystem change. And this is both extent and integrity of ecosystems. So this map shows the availability of ecosystem assessments under the IUCN Red List of Ecosystems protocol, with the pink and red showing completed assessments and yellow those underway. And this is just increasing very rapidly as well. We now have over 3,000 ecosystem types around the world that have been assessed in the last 5 years. So this established theory, tools and data now allow us to design a science-based goal for ecosystems. An effective ecosystem goal needs 3 core components to halt and reverse biodiversity loss: ecosystem area, integrity, and risk of collapse. So ecosystem area extent is a fundamental measure of environmental change. And so it's included in many goals and legislation. That one's a no-brainer. We also need to include loss of ecosystem integrity, which is its composition, structure and function, because with the loss of integrity, we see increased species extinction risk, reduced capacity of ecosystems to sustain their species and ecosystem functions, and we see resilience diminish, resilience to climate change and other drivers. So the current goal includes ecosystem area and integrity. I've shown the current goal here, or the goal, ecosystem goal component of goal A, but it doesn't include collapse risk, but we argue that it should. So avoiding ecosystem collapse is fundamental to a goal for halting biodiversity loss, just like avoiding species extinctions. It's a basic unit of biodiversity. By including reference to collapse risk or reducing collapse risk, or the probability of the ecosystem collapsing, it means that we're preventing ecosystems collapsing, we're committing to preventing collapse, preventing ecosystems from becoming threatened and stopping them from becoming more threatened, just like we have goals for reducing extinction risk. In terms of the current goal, in addition to adding reference to ecosystem collapse risk, we recommend that we have stronger wording to halt ongoing loss of area integrity. So we would propose a goal that seeks to halt and reverse loss, not just to increase the area integrity. We need to halt the ongoing loss of ecosystems now, especially in countries like Australia, where we have the wealth and the social safety nets to do so justly. And we've already, certainly in my part of the world, converted so much of our natural ecosystems for human use into the very strongly anthropogenic ecosystems. And so what we propose is actually quite similar to what was proposed in the Forest Loss and Degradation Agreement at COP26 in Glasgow for the climate change. And I'll come back to that later. So restoration is the only way that we can reverse loss, but it's slow and it's uncertain and expensive. And for many ecosystems, even the best restoration outcomes are incomplete relative to existing areas of high integrity. So restored areas just don't achieve the same biodiversity value and functioning as original ecosystems, certainly not in the shorter term, and particularly when you're restoring from scratch. And so this means we need to focus on halting absolute loss. If we adopt a no net loss framing, that allows habitat loss to be compensated for with restoration, we might achieve a net gain in area, but we will inevitably see an absolute and net loss in integrity as you're replacing areas of higher integrity with restored areas. So this means there's a direct trade-off between flexibility in one part of the goal, no net loss of ecosystem area, and then achieving the other part of the goal, no loss of ecosystem integrity. And this also has important implications for achieving goals for species and nature's contributions to people, which depend on ecosystem integrity. So if you keep on losing ecosystem integrity, then you'll lose species and the benefits that the nature supplies to people or provides for people, and that connection to country. Okay. So these are connected concepts, and so we've developed a very simple theory of change that shows how these concepts of ecosystem area and integrity collapse risk connect. So the direct drivers of biodiversity loss cause declines in area and integrity, and in turn these increase the risk of ecosystem collapse. So through loss of area, you can also lose integrity through edge effects and loss of species and processes that need large areas. And as integrity declines, eventually the ecosystem degrades to a point that it transforms into something else or it collapses, and then the area is lost.